My name is Jeff Jarmock. I am a senior security researcher with Dell SecureWorks. This is my first time presenting at Black Hat Europe. I have previously presented at Black Hat USA, DEF CON, DerbyCon, some other conferences in the US, but never before in Europe, so I'm really excited to be here. So I appreciate you all coming to my talk. I'm sure you all saw the other talk going on also relates to security protocols, more on the IETF side and what's being done to improve protocols. So there's a little bit of an overlap in our material. So Black Hat has said they're going to post our talks online early, so everyone will have an opportunity to see that other talk pretty soon. And I know I myself am looking forward to it, so I encourage you to check that out as well. So this talk is about SSL interception proxies and some of the risks that they may unintentionally introduce through a phenomenon I've called transitive trust. And we'll describe exactly what I mean by that in a little bit here. So a brief overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to start off looking at some of the history of SSL and TLS, how the protocol operates at a pretty basic level, just to make sure that we're all familiar with that. It'll probably be a review for a lot of people, but we'll go through that fairly quickly. Then we'll introduce interception proxies, what I mean when I use that term, how they operate, and why they've become to be fairly popular. We'll look at some of the risks that can be introduced by interception, and then we'll look at the failure modes of these devices. And what I mean when I say failure modes is how they operate when they encounter an invalid certificate, what they do to preserve user experience in that case, and how the decisions that they make in their failure mode may change the risk involved in that decision somewhat. We're going to look at some tools to test for some of these cases, and I'm going to disclose a few vulnerabilities here in some popular interception proxies. This is only a subset of my work. I've been testing other proxies. There's some other vulnerabilities that I've discovered that I'm still working through disclosure with the vendors. So I won't be discussing those today. And then there's other platforms that I'm still in the process of testing. So that's not incomplete, but we'll get an overview of some examples. And then lastly, I'll have some recommendations both to implementers of these systems as well as designers and programmers who are producing and manufacturing them for sale. So let's start off by just talking about the properties of encryption in general. I pretty much borrowed these terms from Moxie Marlinspike's presentation that he gave at Black Hat USA last year. I've seen it also cited by Nate Lawson and other people. But generally, when we look at crypto systems, there's three properties that are important to those systems. That's privacy, integrity, and authenticity. So privacy is obviously the property that that prohibits other people from intercepting communications, from viewing those communications. Integrity is the prevention of modifying those communications in transit, and then authenticity is aimed at validating the identity of the remote party. So when I'm going to my bank's website, I know it's really my bank. So these three properties underlie everything in SSL, TLS, and other crypto systems, and I find it helpful to keep these in mind as we look at these things and look at how how different aspects of the system relate to these three properties. We look at the history of SSL. It's pretty long. There's a lot of different RFCs here. It all starts with a draft that Netscape put together for SSL2 in 1994. That was revised into an IETF draft in 96 for SSL v3. And then we had the first real RFC in 99 with TLS1. So there's a bit of a name change there too, from SSL to the more general TLS. But SSL has kind of become the common nomenclature. So throughout this talk, when I'm referring to SSL, I'm kind of broadly referring to both SSL v3 and TLS1. TLS 1.1 is also fairly prevalent now, just some minor modifications from TLS 1.0. And 1.2, again, some minor tweaks, but it's not very prevalent yet. There's some closely related RFCs for things like HTTP over TLS, which is really the focus of this talk. And then X509 and certificate revocation lists. And then OCSP, Online Certificate Status Protocol, which is kind of an improvement or an attempt to improve upon CRL. So let's start off by looking at how SSL sessions are established. We've got a client endpoint, we've got a server endpoint. You can call them Alice and Bob if you prefer. But basically, it all starts with the client sending a hello to the server. That hello includes supported protocol version. It may advertise extensions that are supported by the client. A unique session ID that allows for resumption of sessions more quickly and things like that. And then a list of all the cipher suites that are supported by the client. The server responds with its own hello. The server hello will include only one cipher suite that the client offered, which is the preferred cipher suite from the server. So that's how the client and server agree on what ciphers they're going to use. It also includes protocol version, session ID, and so on. There's also the server certificate presented. So that's the means of the server asserting its own identity. The certificate validation is actually not part of the SSL or TLS RFCs. That falls under the X509 RFCs. And then there's a server hello done. Basically, the server saying, OK, I'm ready. What have you got for me? The client then sends a client key exchange message that gives its public key, depending on what cipher suite was chosen. And then it sends a change cipher spec message, which basically says, OK, I'm ready to go. You have my key. We've agreed on a cipher suite. And then the finished message just saying, I'm complete. The server responds with its own change cipher spec, just basically acknowledging that there's an agreed upon cipher suite, and then a final message that says finished. At that point, we've essentially got a secure application layer transport for whatever higher layer protocol. Pretty commonly it's going to be HTTP over TLS. Now there's some variants here that I'm not really addressing. There's a possibility for what's known as mutual authentication, where the client would also send its own certificate. Mutual authentication is difficult for interception proxies because they can't properly impersonate the client. So generally they have to make an all or nothing decision. They either let it through without inspecting it, or they drop it and terminate the session. So for purposes of this discussion, we're not really going to discuss mutual authentication. So when the client receives the certificate from the server, there's a process of validation that's documented in the X509 specifications. This is so that the client can validate the certificate, determine that it hasn't been tampered with, that it's trustworthy, and that it identifies that server. So in that process, the first thing the client really needs to do is just verify the certificate integrity. So there's a digital signature on the certificate that's compared to a hash value for all the certificate properties, just to make sure that the certificate hasn't been tampered with. The next step is to check for certificate expiration. So certificates all contain a start time and an end time. We just want to make sure the current time is between those, so the certificate is valid in the time period that it's presented. This next step is to check the issuer of the certificate. In the case of a self-signed certificate, the certificate's its own issuer, essentially. But otherwise, it'll have an issuer field that reflects who signed that certificate. This may be a root CA directly that the browser trusts implicitly, or rather explicitly through its configuration. Or it may be an intermediate certificate authority, in which case we have to repeat the process for that certificate authority's certificate and so on up the chain until we get to the root. And then the last step is to check revocation. So there's two main protocols for this, CRL, Certificate Revocation List, and Online Certificate Status Protocol, OCSP. CRL checking is defined in X509. OCSP is an extension to X509. But they basically both perform the same function in checking with certificate authority to make sure that that certificate hasn't been revoked which might occur if it were stolen or the private keys were misplaced somehow. The main difference between the two is the certificate revocation list is just a periodic check done by the client, caches the list. OCSP is a more active online response protocol. Both of them have some pretty well-documented security flaws. I'm really not going to get deeply into those in this talk, but both are known to have weaknesses and be subject to bypass. So there's a lot of debate in the security community about what do we do to replace these, and how do we ensure that we have a working revocation mechanism going forward. So the result of all this, again, we've got privacy, integrity, and authenticity. In typical use, the cipher suite will ensure that we have both privacy and integrity, that people can't sniff our communications, they can't modify them in transit. The authenticity property largely derives from that X509 certificate validation process. That seeks to strongly confirm the server's identity and make sure that there's not a man in the middle that's intercepting our communications. The problem is there's been an increase in malicious uses of encryption, and SSL specifically. These same properties, privacy, integrity, and authenticity, are things that are often valuable to attackers. In the case of privacy and integrity, the cipher suite can bypass detection and prevention technologies. Your typical intrusion detection is going to be blind to encrypted traffic. It can't see what the contents are. It can't identify if they're malicious. And in the case of an IPS technology, it can't take a blocking action based on that. And then authenticity remains largely the same. Oftentimes malware isn't as concerned about authenticity, but they still have that property of being able to verify the remote endpoint. So the enterprise, in response to this, has started to intercept, inspect, and filter encrypted traffic more and more. We're seeing things like DLP technologies, web content filters, anti-malware, IDS, IPS, next generation deep packet inspection firewalls, and endpoint security suites, host antivirus, things like that on the endpoint, starting to intercept SSL so that they can inspect the contents. So I've kind of lumped all of these products together in the term SSL interception proxy. Different products are marketed under different names, so it helps to kind of have a common name for this technology. I thought interception proxy was the best way to describe what it's doing without getting into marketing speak, calling it secure inspection or something like that. When I use the word proxy here, it's important to separate. I'm not necessarily referring to a network layer 3 proxy. I'm referring to a proxy on the SSL protocol level. So that can often be implemented as a traditional web proxy, but not always. So it's important to make that distinction of what exactly we're proxying. So regardless of where in the flow these proxies are implemented, they all work basically the same way, and that's a simple man in the middle. Nobody markets them as man in the middles. I don't think that that would probably sell very well. But fundamentally, that's how it's operating. So it negotiates two sessions. There's a server-side session where it's acting as the client, and a client-side session where it's acting as the server. On the client-side session, it needs to generate new keys dynamically so that it can impersonate the legitimate server. This is essentially a disruption of authenticity to enable us to affect privacy and integrity so that we can inspect and filter that traffic. One of the results of this is that what was an end-to-end client-server session becomes two point-to-point sessions. So you've got session from the client to the proxy and another session from the proxy to the server. So if we look at a diagram of how the protocol exchange works here, we've now got three devices: client endpoint, the interception proxy, and the server endpoint. We've got two protocol exchanges. This is the same SSL handshake process we saw earlier. And it results in two separate secure transports. The key property is that in the middle, the plain text of that communication is available on the proxy for inspection, detection, etc. So the biggest change here is in this step that's highlighted with the server hello and the certificate. There's two separate cipher suite negotiations. There's two separate certificates, one of which is the server's legitimate certificate on the server-side session, which is off to the right, and the other on the left side, on the client-side session, is the dynamically generated certificate that was created by the interception proxy. So when we think about how the client is going to validate these, it becomes clear that the client needs to somehow trust the certificate authority that the proxy is using. There's two major means of accomplishing that. The first is to use a private certificate authority and distribute that certificate authority as a trust root to all of the endpoints under the scope of that interception proxy. This is the most common means of doing this, but it can be a logistical challenge. If you've got a large environment with thousands or tens of thousands of devices, just establishing that trust relationship can be burdensome. This is made more complex by the prevalence of mobile devices. Bring your own device where you might not, have any kind of management tools. So as a result, there's been some need by large corporations to obtain a public sub-CA. So what that is it's basically a delegated public root authority. If you're able to get a trusted public root to give you a certificate that lets you sign arbitrary certificates under their root, those certificates will validate on most endpoints with no other configuration. This is obviously what's the word I'm looking for? What's that? Yeah, bone of contention. That's a good way to put it. It makes things a lot more convenient for the enterprise, but there's a large risk if those signing keys are exposed, because it's not just that enterprise's customers that would trust those certificates. It's anybody in the world who trusts that root CA. So these aren't really commonly discussed publicly. TrustWave recently came forward and said, hey, we saw the errors of our ways. We did issue a man-in-the-middle sub-CA certificate to one client, and we think that's a bad idea. We're not going to do that anymore. So I give them credit for coming forward with no provocation and disclosing that they were doing this. But it's kind of concerning that the practice occurred in the first place. GeoTrust is really the most publicly known example of this. They used to advertise the service publicly on their website under the branding GeoRoot. They've since removed that branding. This was highlighted previously both by Moxie Marlinspike and Dan Kaminsky. It's kind of unknown how many other CAs are engaging in this process. As part of the response to TrustWave, Mozilla sent a formal communication to all their CAs requiring that they disclose if they've done this, that they revoke the certificates if they have. So far, the responses haven't really indicated that they have. So depending on how much you trust the CAs, maybe it's not that common, but the general consensus is that given the hundreds of public CAs that are available, this is occurring somewhere. And with the current PKI system, any one of those CAs can sign any certificate. So if there's one public sub-CA out there that gets compromised, whoever has that key can sign any certificate they want and validate it on just about any endpoint in the world. So this is another big concern. So there's some unintended side effects that are introduced by interception proxies. I said before, there's two separate cipher suite negotiations. These cipher suites may end up being negotiated to a lower degree of security than if the client were communicating with the server directly. Probably the best example of that is that Google has recently started using Diffie-Hellman certificate, Diffie-Hellman key exchange in order to achieve perfect forward secrecy. So the idea there is if the server's key is compromised, You can't go back and decrypt traffic that was encrypted previously. So if someone's sitting out there sniffing all Gmail traffic and they somehow, years from now, manage to get Gmail certificates, that traffic they collected today would not be compromised. Diffie-Hellman cipher suites don't tend to be widely supported, so there's a possibility that a proxy may not support it, in which case those two cipher suite negotiations would lack perfect forward secrecy and reduce the overall end-to-end security. Another side effect is that you've made the proxy a really high-value target. It has access to clear text encrypted data. Well, I don't want to say encrypted data, but what is thought to be encrypted data in clear text, which is obviously pretty valuable to attackers. It also has those private keys, both for the certificates that are generated dynamically, as well as the signing keys for that CA. If the CA trust has been distributed to all the client endpoints, and I'm able to compromise those private keys, I can now impersonate any site I want for anybody who trusts that root. So those both make the proxy a high-value target. There's potential for legal concerns here as well. There's some questions around what the enterprise has to do to disclose to their users that they're intercepting and decrypting traffic. And there's the idea of what's the user's expectation. Obviously, the legal questions are going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, so I can't speak to those in detail. But I think it's important to investigate and work with your legal teams prior to implementing a proxy. And the last unintended side effect here is the one that I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about, and that's what I'd call transitive trust. So the idea behind transitive trust is that the client can no longer verify the server's identity independently. Instead, we have this transitive relationship where the client trusts the proxy CA, the proxy validates the server certificate, therefore the client trusts the server certificate indirectly. So let's look at an example. Let's say we have a client attempting to communicate with example.com. Example.com presents its certificate. And just for the sake of argument, let's say that certificate's signed by DigiNotar. Yeah, I hear chuckles. I'm sure everybody's familiar with DigiNotar was compromised and was used to issue fraudulent certificates. The browser manufacturers responded by revoking trust in DigiNotar's root. So here we have representation of the client's root trust store. Highlighted in red there, we see DigiNotar's public CA is not trusted. So the client, as a result, doesn't trust that server certificate CA. It doesn't trust that certificate. If we put an interception proxy in the middle, and this interception proxy was not updated to revoke trust in DigiNotar, we have our first example of transitive trust. In this case, server presents its certificate signed by DigiNotar. Interception proxy says, okay, no problems. The client's trust roots are unmodified. So the client doesn't trust DigiNotar, but it trusts the corporate CA that's used by the interception proxy to issue certificates. So the certificate that it receives that's rewritten by the proxy validates with no problems. So we can see that the client ends up trusting the DigiNotar signed certificate despite the fact that they would not have directly trusted. You have a question? Right, it does go the other way as well. That's a good point. If the proxy is well managed and you track your trust roots on the proxy, you can proactively revoke trust prior to patching all the browsers. That's certainly true. One of my concerns with that is the idea of mobile endpoints and roving endpoints. That's true so long as that client is communicating through the proxy. If I take my laptop and go home and get on my Wi-Fi at home and I haven't updated my roots, those roots are still in effect. But that's certainly a good point, that it does go both ways. Anyhow, as the example shows here, In this particular case, the proxy wasn't updated, and we end up with the client trusting the server. There's all kinds of other flaws that can be transitive aside from just root trust. That's just one of the most, the easiest examples to illustrate. Any case where the proxy trusts a certificate that the client wouldn't directly trust can result in a transitive trust issue. We can see this with self-signed certificates. If the server presents a self-signed certificate, depending on the configuration of that interception proxy, if it validates self-signed certificates, generates a new certificate under its own CA, and sends that off to the client's going to trust it as well. The same is true for expired certificates and revoked certificates, as well as certificates related to some more recent validation attacks. The first case of this is a basic constraints validation problem that goes back to a discovery Moxie Marlinspike disclosed in 2002. So basic constraints are a property of a certificate that, among other things, can say whether or not that certificate is a valid certificate authority. What Moxie found in 2002 was that Internet Explorer wasn't validating that property. So the result was that any leaf node certificate that is a certificate that's not authorized to be a CA can in fact be used to sign another certificate as if it were an intermediate CA. That was patched years ago in Internet Explorer. It's no longer the case, but it's since been discovered to affect other platforms. In 2009, Moxie again disclosed OpenSSL was performing improper basic constraints validation. More recently, 2011, TrustWave found that the iOS was not validating basic constraints. And we'll see later in this slide, I've got another example of this problem. So it's a 10-year-old problem now, but it keeps popping up in different areas. The next attack type is null prefix injection. So this is basically a difference between the X509 format that requires properties to be length encoded versus the more common C-style string encoding where you have a null terminated string. The result is that by inserting a null character into the common name field, you can get a certificate authority to sign a certificate for a domain you own. However, the null character can terminate the processing of that certificate name field when it's parsed on the client. So as a result of that, you can essentially change the scope of validity for a certificate. To be clear, I haven't found any problems with the null prefix injection on proxies to date, but the potential is there. If a proxy is subject to to improper validation of subject names terminated by a null character, when it regenerates the new certificate, it would generate it for the name that it parsed out and completely change the scope of that certificate. But I haven't found an example of that in the wild, so that's actually pretty encouraging. And then another issue that we can see arise is key pair caching. So dynamically generating SSL key pairs is somewhat computationally expensive. This is especially the case for network-based interception proxies that may be handling a large number of concurrent connections. If every one of those connections results in a new certificate being generated, there's quite a bit of overhead, especially for commonly accessed services, let's say Google or Gmail or something like that, that hundreds, thousands of users may hit in a given day. So as a result, key pairs are generally cached on the proxy to help performance. But how those cached key pairs are indexed is extremely important. And I've got some diagrams here to help us visualize that. So in this example, we have a client connecting through an interception proxy. As before, the server presents its certificate, interception proxy trusts it, validates it, it's all good. So it generates a new certificate for the client-side session, stores that key pair in its cache, and presents that certificate to the client. Client validates that everything's good. So this is just the first visit. So A little while later, that same user, maybe another user behind that proxy, comes along and accesses the same site. We already have the key pair in the cache. So what we have here is the server presents its certificate. The interception proxy says, oh, I already generated a certificate for that host name. I'm going to pull it from my cache and present it to the client. Now, where the problem comes in, if we have an attacker acting as a man in the middle on the outside, and the key pair has already been cached, we have a scenario like this. The server, again, presents its certificate. The attacker doesn't necessarily validate it, doesn't really care about it too much, so they just drop it. They insert their own certificate, and you'll notice here that the certificate fingerprint that I'm using in my examples has changed. So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The attacker, whoops, yeah, that's right. The attacker is inserting a certificate with a different fingerprint. But if the proxy's cache is based solely on the subject name, it's going to still see that that certificate is valid for that name. So it's going to read the certificate from its cache and present it to the client. So what happened here, the certificate that was presented on the outside of the proxy on the server-side session is changed, but the client's still receiving the same certificate. So that could be a problem. It could be a bigger problem if the interception proxy has other validation flaws. That external certificate might be self-signed. It might be expired. It might be revoked. And if the proxy is subject to those flaws, it'll still validate it. And not only that, the internal client still sees the same certificate that he originally saw when everything was perfectly normal. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you
Sure.
back? But shouldn't the proxy, it's a valid certificate. It says other public CA.
Right.
It should accept.
Well, in this case, it should accept it. So what I'm illustrating here, I've got a valid certificate under a different CA. So that's a good point. My example might not be completely. I'll probably update this slide. So it would accept it, but it should generate a new certificate for the client. The client should see that, okay, I was receiving one certificate, now I'm getting another one. If you instead imagine that instead of having it signed by another public CA, let's say it was a self-signed certificate, now we have a case where the proxy probably shouldn't have validated it, but they did. And not only that, what I'm really trying to illustrate here is the fact that the client-side certificate doesn't change. The validation flaws are kind of independent from the caching issue, but the caching issue makes them worse because the internal client doesn't even see anything's changed, let alone attacking his session. So thanks for pointing that out, because that is probably a little bit unclear. So another thing we want to consider is the failure modes of the device, and that's what does the device do when it encounters an invalid certificate. There's nothing in any of these RFCs that cover how to man in the middle SSL. It's just not something the protocol is designed for. So this leads to some tough trade-offs on the part of the manufacturers of these devices. There's three common approaches. I've called them fail, closed, friendly air, and pass-through. This is another case where different vendors have different names for their modes, but this is essentially how they all operate. And each has its own trade-offs. So if we looked at a fail-closed failure mode, essentially we encounter an invalid certificate, we're going to terminate both sessions, server-side and client-side. So that's clearly the most secure of these three options. However, it might result in the user not receiving any sort of message as to what happened. They just get a vague, unable to connect error message generated by their browser. So that's kind of a poor user experience. In some cases, the proxy will have an out-of-band agent that can be configured on the endpoint, a little program that runs in a sys tray that can communicate other information. But those can be a deployment burden. They're not available for all platforms. There's a lot of trade-offs on that approach as well. When we talk about a friendly error, What I mean by this is a case where the proxy detects an invalid certificate, it terminates the server-side session immediately. It leaves the client-side session open, but instead of serving up the page, it serves up a message saying, server returned a bad certificate. So this can give a little bit better user experience because they get some feedback about what happened. But the pages are served in the context of the site that the user requested. In some cases, they include content from the certificate. It might include the subject name, the issuer, et cetera, from that certificate. So this opens up the possibility for the malformed certificate to be a web attack vector in the context of the site that the user requested. So you could potentially get cross-site scripting issues, things like that, targeting session cookies for the site that the user was connecting to when you presented that invalid cert. Another issue here is that some of these friendly error pages will allow the user to override it. So they'll give if you accept this error, click here to continue. In some cases, that click here to continue applies to all users behind that proxy, not just that one session. And in some cases, it's susceptible to cross-site request forgery. So you may be able to click that button for them. I don't have any examples to cite today on either the cross-site scripting through certificates or cross-site request forgery, but I've seen at least cross-site request forgery in the wild, and I'll be disclosing the platform at a later date. The last failure mode is pass-through. So this is most common for name and expiry related issues rather than root trustworthiness. And essentially in a pass-through mode, we continue the server-side session, and when generating the client-side certificate, we just generate a certificate that's malformed in the same way as the server-side certificate. So if we have an expired certificate on the server side, we copy the validity dates and generate an expired certificate on the client side. This preserves the general user experience. You'll still get the same message that says, the certificate's expired, the certificate's self-signed, et cetera. But it doesn't, it relies on the client side to validate that. So it's kind of a missed opportunity for improving security, not directly a security vulnerability itself. Now there are some strange interactions if you have multiple proxies chained together. Some of them will trust the certificates that are generated by the intermediate CA completely without even validating the expiry dates. So if you have one proxy on the outside that's in pass-through mode with another proxy on the inside that's trusting that proxy, it gets complicated. But there's some opportunities for bypass there. I recently found the Convergence project, Moxie Marlinspike's alternative to the CA, the CA trust model. It itself operates as a proxy, and in order to handle the case where it's behind an interception proxy, it has some different handling for generated certificates. And I'd recently found that if it encounters an expired certificate generated by an upstream proxy, it would trust it. That's been patched in Convergence. And it's kind of an edge case. Really, I don't think too many people are running Convergence behind proxies. And I doubt that would be something that would be targeted for attack, but it just illustrates the possibility. Another issue here is that it preserves the user experience, but it doesn't necessarily give them visibility into the original certificate. So if I encounter a self-signed certificate and the proxy regenerates a new self-signed certificate, I'll get a warning that says it's self-signed. The certificate fingerprints changed, the issuer's changed. So if, for example, I know the administrator of the remote site and I call them on the phone to validate the certificate, there's no way to do that because we have different fingerprints. I'm not seeing the original cert. And then, of course, users, when confronted with confusing dialog boxes, don't always make the right choices. So in testing for these issues, I developed a framework that I'm making available publicly. You can go out to ssltest.offenseindepth.com. If you visit this from behind the proxy that you're trying to test, it gives you a table in HTML that lists several different vulnerabilities. Each of those vulnerabilities has a separate host associated with it. That host presents a malformed certificate meant to demonstrate that vulnerability. So the table itself attempts to include CSS from each of these hosts that will reformat the table to show you if it's vulnerable. So it becomes a pretty simple eye chart to check for some of these common vulnerabilities. The page also shows the request headers, which can be interesting to help you, track down what device is responsible if there's a VIA header, for example. But it's worth noting, too, that you might get certificate warnings when you access this, specifically if you're behind a proxy that's in a pass-through failure mode. And if you do encounter warnings, how you react to those warnings will affect the test results, just as it would if a user were in the same scenario. So that's important to note. Most browsers will silently drop certificates, drop connections involving untrusted certificates if they're included in a page and it's not the explicit page that you're navigating to. Internet Explorer is a little bit unique in that it gives you a dialog at the top, one of those little bars that pops up that says, some resources loaded on this page could not be securely loaded. But both Firefox and Chrome will just silently discard that request. So here's an example of visiting the site from Firefox. This is a direct visit. I'm not behind a proxy, so it's not surprising to see that Firefox itself is not vulnerable to this, to any of these issues. And this is an interesting point. This can also be used to test client endpoints, although I'm really intending it for proxies. If you visit it without a proxy, it'll test that client. So if you hit it from a mobile device, you might get some interesting results. The last link there, the null character certificate, I couldn't actually find a public certificate authority that would issue me null character certs. I'm still pretty confident that there's at least one out there in the scope of all the certificate authorities. But in a lot of cases, you have to pay just to send them a certificate signing request. And I wasn't going to pay, hundreds of dollars times 300 just to test all the certificate authorities. So in this case, I generated it under a private certificate authority. So that certificate authority cert is linked there under that hot link that says nullchar CA. If you really want to test that, you need to trust that certificate authority from your proxy. I would obviously not recommend doing that in a production environment. It's my certificate authority. I've destroyed the private key since, but you probably don't want to trust random CAs. So if we change the Foxy proxy settings and visit through a proxy, we might see something like this. So this is the same page. The difference here is that the hosts associated with these vulnerabilities, the certificate's validated. And as a result, CSS loads and flags that vulnerable. So in this case, we've got unknown certificate authorities, self-signed certificate authorities, the basic constraints problem, and revoked certificates are all trusted by the proxy and by transitive trust are trusted by the client browser, even though the client browser wasn't susceptible on its own. What's worth noting in this particular case, this proxy operates in a pass-through mode. So the mismatched certificate name and the expired certificate were actually presented to my browser. But as I said before, Firefox discards content from untrusted certificates that are included in pages silently. If I visited those two hosts directly, I would get a certificate warning dialog. But just due to the way Firefox operates, it suppresses that when it's an include. So there is still an opportunity for a client to be exploited that way, but it requires client interaction the same as it would if there were no proxy there. So on this particular request, we can see the request headers were modified a little bit, and there's a VIA header there that's blacked out. But this is Cisco Iron Port, so a pretty major market interception proxy. So we've disclosed all these issues to Cisco and have been working with them to get them addressed. So I'm going to kind of run through them and run through Cisco's response. The first two issues are closely related, self-signed certificates and unknown CA routes, both being accepted. There's no CVE for these. This is a configuration issue, essentially. In the default configuration, an Iron Port will accept self-signed and untrusted routes. However, the bug ID gives you some mitigating steps. There's a screenshot here that shows some of the configuration. And essentially, you see everything is marked as monitor. That's Cisco's name for what I call pass-through. They're still intercepting, but they're passing client certificate errors onto the client. So in this case, you can override that and drop expired certificates, drop certificates with a mismatched host name, or an unrecognized root authority. So unrecognized root authority covers both self-signed and unknown CAs. But Cisco has a note here, and it's kind of a scary warning that that there's going to be no end user notification if the session's dropped, which is basically saying that if you change it to drop, you're going into a drop failure mode rather than a pass-through failure mode. So the warning here is a little bit scary that, users aren't going to get notification, but that's kind of what you want if you're encountering obviously invalid certificates. So anybody who uses IronPort, I'd definitely encourage you to check out these settings, look at your configurations, and take action. But there's no CVE, and Cisco doesn't really have plans to change this because it's seen as a configuration issue. They also don't check certificate revocation lists or online certificate status protocol. There is a CVE filed for that, and there's a bug ID to reference as well. So if you're able to obtain a revoked certificate, you can go on using that as if it were never revoked. Certificate basic constraints aren't validated, so that's kind of scary. Anybody with a valid certificate under a trusted CA can use that certificate to sign other certificates, and they'll validate just fine. And they also have problems with key pair caching. It seems from my tests that they're indexing on the host name, possibly a combination of host name and server IP address, neither of which is going to be changed by a man-in-the-middle attacker. So they're going to be addressing this by indexing the cache based on the certificate fingerprint in addition to the host name. So if the certificate changes, you would see that change reflected in the client-side certificate. All of these findings apply to Cisco IronPort Web Security Appliance 713-014. There's not currently patches available. I've been working with Cisco on this for quite some time, and their current targets for patching these issues are July of 2012, so a couple of months away yet, in version 7.5, possibly 7.7 for some of the more complicated issues. But I'd encourage you to pay attention to that and keep an eye out for patches. Some other points that relate to IronPort. There's no user interface for managing trust routes. So to the point earlier that the proxy can be used to remove trust that an endpoint already trusts, not on IronPort. They have issued patches to address recent revocations, DigiNotar, DigiCert Malaysia, etc. Obviously, there's always a bit of lag in patch deployment. That's correct. The administrator has no means of determining trust routes. The routes that ship with the device are the routes you trust, no more, no less, on Cisco IronPort. You're essentially trusting Cisco to tell you who you trust. So you're kind of delegating your trust a little bit further.
Or do you want to add your CA into IronPort?
You can't. There's no facility for adding a private CA as a trusted root. So this is clearly a design problem, and one that they tell me they're going to address. Now, in a lot of cases, I think the fact that it's been this way for so long that you can't manage trust routes kind of highlights the fact that oftentimes administrators don't pay attention to them. As long as they're getting to sites that they want to get to, there's not a lot of concern paid to the overall trust. And again, that pass-through failure mode can create problems in combination with downstream validation by other proxies or by endpoints that might behave strangely. Another one, a Staro security gateway. As of firmware 8.3, pattern is more antivirus signatures and things of that nature, IDS signatures. Doesn't check certificate revocation lists or OCSP. When I reported this to Astaro, now owned by Sophos, they said that it's a design decision. They see certificate revocation listing and online status protocol as broken in general, and as a result, they don't feel a need to check for revoked certificates. Yeah, I understand their point that there's problems with CRLs and OCSP checking, but I still think you kind of want to make a best effort. But they're monitoring developments as far as emerging standards and proposals to better handle revocation, and they said they'll try and include some of those in a future response. I'll get to your question in just a minute. I'm running a little short on time. I just want to make sure I get through things. Now, Astaro operates in a friendly error failure mode. They do include support for managing trust routes and also certificate blacklists. So in some of the other cases where the Komodo breach, where some certificates were fraudulently issued, you can blacklist those individual certificates, and they push out updates to both of these frequently. This device performs many other functions, so it's got a built-in updating mechanism to get AV updates and things like that. So they leverage that to update trust routes and update certificate lists. So it's a little bit different than the Cisco Iron Port, where you have to install a patch, a hotfix to change your trust routes. In this case, they're changed pretty rapidly. So that's an interesting approach that I wanted to highlight. There's two other platforms that I'm able to discuss today that I haven't found any issues in, and that's Checkpoint Security Gateway, specifically R7520, and Microsoft Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 Service Pack 2. Both of these include support for managing trust routes, and both of these by default operate in a fail closed mode. So there's no opportunity for a client to accept a certificate. So yay, Checkpoint and Microsoft. Like I said, I'll probably have some other examples down the road a little bit, but that's really the only specific cases I can cite today. So recommendations to implementers: patch these devices regularly. Consider them high-value targets. You want to patch both for root trust updates, as well as for vulnerabilities on the device itself. There's been some recent disclosures of cross-site scripting issues on the management interfaces and things of that nature. Combined with the sensitive function of these applications, that could be a real problem. So consider them a high patch priority. Test them prior to deployment. You want to test both the code that's sold to you as well as the configuration. As the Iron Port example illustrates, the default configuration may not be what you want, especially if you're strongly security-minded. Consider both security and user experience. Inform end users of interception, primarily for kind of a legal hedge. Make sure that your acceptable use policies include encrypted traffic and things like that. Be aware of your trust routes and be ready to change that. The next time DigiNotar, a similar case happens, you don't want to be left scratching your head about whether or not you trust them. You want to know, and you want to be able to react to that quickly. Hardened hosts running proxies, that's I touched on that when I was talking about patching. Consider the failure modes, and overall, just realize that interception isn't without consequence. It doesn't necessarily have to be an overall negative consequence, but you're taking a protocol that was designed to be secure point to point and shoving something else in the middle. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when we ask our security protocols to do things they weren't meant to do, there might be some unseen consequences. As far as developers, allow administrators to manage trust routes. That's kind of to the point of not being able to do that on Iron Port. Not as important, but I would still say highly important. Be able to blacklist individual certificates, and things like that. Make the defaults secure. Obviously, the same settings aren't going to apply in every environment, but I feel pretty strongly that the default state should be the most secure, and you should have to manually interact to to lessen your security settings. Obviously, I recommend developers as well test their systems and just kind of be wary of attacks against authenticity and how you might be enabling attackers to carry those out more easily. Consider update and patch deployments and how those take place. If you bundle security fixes and you bundle CA root changes in with general updates, it's not going to be as as easy for your users to adopt those updates. And then consider private key security. We want to make sure that that on that device it's extremely hard to get to get private keys off, especially the private key of the certificate authority itself. So that's really all I have. I wanted to ask you all to please complete the speaker feedback surveys. It gives us as speakers valuable feedback in in our style and what you liked about our talk. And it's good feedback to Black Hat so that they can they can better choose who's going to be a speaker in the future, and what sort of content to make available. And I think I might have a couple of minutes for questions. Do I have a couple? Yeah, like 3 minutes, so 1 or 2. I promised there was somebody down here had a question. I promised I would get to it, but yeah.
Yeah, but a Starrow product not checking CRL or OCSP, isn't it a scary trend? If I recall correctly, Google announced that Chrome browser will completely stop checking CRL or
Right.
OCSP and they'd rather provide the revocation information through browser patches.
Right.
It just states that both protocols.
Yeah, so the question was surrounding Astaro's lack of CRL and OCSP checking, and the recent announcement by Google that they're going to change how Chrome does its CRL checking. Now, I think that what Google's doing with Chrome has been a little bit misstated in some of the reports. It's not so much that they're going to stop checking CRLs, but they're going to change how the certificate list is delivered. So rather than checking with each CA's individual published CRL endpoint, Google will push down a master list of all the CRLs. I have some concerns about it. I'm interested to see how it operates. There could potentially be a little bit of a lag time introduced by Cisco's bundling and pushing them. There was also a statement made in the post that announced that said something to the effect of most revocations aren't due to key compromise, and so those revocations don't need to be pushed to the clients at all. If that's the case, I have some concerns with that. It's not always clear from the CRL list itself. There is a facility for a reason code that they can say why a certificate was revoked, but it's not always clear clear whether or not it was compromised. In some cases, it's not even clear to the organization who loses the certificate. So I kind of feel that any sort of revocation alternative needs to consider all revocations, and I'm not real sure if Google's changes are going to address that. But that's certainly something to watch. I can understand why Google's looking for alternatives. Maybe one more question. I've only got another minute. Yeah.
How easy is it for an attacker to see that the client is behind such a proxy?
Well, yeah, the question is how easy is it for the client to see the attackers, or for the attacker to see the clients behind a proxy? In this case, it's right there in the VIA header. So if you've got a single HTTP or HTTPS request that's gone through that proxy, and you can identify the version. Now, not all these devices publish VIA headers, but most of them will manipulate headers in some fashion. It might be as subtle as reordering them. Maybe they'll change the accept encoding. So with some effort, if you're targeting a specific proxy, you can identify with pretty decent certainty in a lot of cases what sort of proxy that is. So I think that's all the time I have. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to grab me in the hall. I'll be around the whole conference. So thanks for your time.